The beaches of Normandy, June 1944. Allied troops are pushing inland through bocage country. Mortars thump in the distance, rifle fire cracks through hedgerows, and in the middle of it all, men are heating cans over pocket stoves and boiling water in steel helmets. Combat doesn't stop for meals, but soldiers still needed to eat. The question wasn't whether to cook, it was how to do it fast enough that you didn't become a target. This is the reality of frontline cooking in one of history's most brutal campaigns. No mess halls, no hot plates, just ration tins, improvised fires, and whatever you could scrounge from a war-torn countryside. Food preparation became another survival skill, practiced under threat of enemy fire and taught through necessity. What soldiers ate, how they cooked it, and why it mattered goes beyond nutrition. It was a fight to stay functional in conditions designed to break the human body. When Allied forces hit Normandy's beaches, they carried their food with them. C-rations and K-rations. Both were designed for one purpose: survive combat conditions without refrigeration, without cooking, without falling apart in a soaking wet rucksack. C-rations came in cans: meat and vegetable hash, meat and beans, pork and rice. Each can held around 12 ounces of pre-cooked food sealed against spoilage. The cans could survive a parachute drop, an ocean crossing, or being shoved to the bottom of a pack under ammunition and grenades. K-rations were lighter. Boxed meals in waxed cardboard: breakfast, dinner, supper. Each box contained a canned meat product, hardtack biscuits, a fruit bar, instant coffee powder, sugar tablets, and cigarettes. The meat might be chopped ham and eggs, or potted meat, or processed cheese. Soldiers called it rubber and glue. The taste wasn't the point. The point was caloric density and chemical stability. These rations could sit in a Normandy hedgerow through summer heat and rain and still be edible weeks later. Troops complained constantly. The canned hash tasted like salted paste. The biscuits were so hard they cracked teeth. The lemonade powder in K-rations was rumored to contain bromide to suppress libido, though no evidence supported it. But complaints didn't change the fact that these rations worked. They kept men upright and moving when fresh food was impossible. Heating rations on the front meant balancing two needs: warmth and concealment. Hot food raised morale and made digestion easier. But smoke and flame gave away positions. German observers watched for cooking fires. Mortar teams adjusted range based on campfire glow. So soldiers adapted. The simplest method was the Tommy cooker, a small folding stove fueled by solidified alcohol tablets or canned heat. You punched holes in the ration can, set it on the burner, and waited. 5 minutes got you warm hash. The flame was small, controllable, and produced minimal smoke. When fuel tablets ran out, troops dug Dakota fire holes. 2 pits connected by an underground tunnel. Fire went in one pit, air fed through the tunnel, smoke dispersed low to the ground. The design hid flames from view and reduced the smoke signature. Soldiers learned it from combat engineers, then taught each other. But sometimes cooking wasn't worth the risk. When German patrols were close or artillery was active, men ate cold, straight from the can. No heat, no preparation. Just pry the lid, eat with a spoon or your fingers, and move on. When units pulled back from immediate contact, cooking became communal. Squads pooled rations. Someone scrounged firewood, someone else found water. Steel helmets doubled as cooking pots. Placed over small twig fires, they could boil water for coffee or heat a mixture of combined ration cans into something resembling stew. The helmet wasn't ideal. It conducted heat poorly and gave everything a metallic taste. But it was there, it was waterproof, and it worked. After the meal, you wiped it out and put it back on your head. Norman hedgerows provided some concealment. Thick vegetation blocked sightlines. Soldiers cooked in sunken lanes and behind stone walls, using terrain to mask activity. Speed mattered. The faster you cooked, the less time you were exposed. Field cooking wasn't about technique. It was about efficiency, risk assessment, and making do with what you had while someone a few hundred yards away was trying to kill you. Behind the immediate front lines, mobile field kitchens operated. These weren't permanent installations. They were truck-mounted stoves and supply trailers that followed units as the line advanced. When terrain and tactical conditions allowed, cooks set up and prepared hot meals for troops rotating out of combat. The kitchens served stews, dehydrated vegetables rehydrated in boiling water, powdered eggs scrambled in large pans, canned meat heated and mixed with whatever was available, bread when supply lines permitted, coffee in large urns. The food wasn't gourmet. Dehydrated potatoes turned to paste. Powdered eggs had a chalky texture and no flavor. But it was hot, and it wasn't eaten crouched in a foxhole with a rifle across your lap. Hot meals reached men who hadn't tasted warm food in days. Soldiers who'd been living on cold rations and adrenaline. The psychological effect mattered as much as the nutrition. A hot meal meant you were still part of an organized army. It meant supply lines were functioning. It meant someone behind you cared whether you had more than a tin of hash. Field kitchens also sourced locally when possible. Norman farms provided eggs, milk, butter, and vegetables. Liberation brought cooperation. French civilians traded food for cigarettes, chocolate, or simply goodwill. Cooks supplemented rations with fresh provisions, improving both nutrition and morale. But field kitchens had limits. They couldn't operate under direct fire. They required fuel, water, and relative security. When units pushed forward into contested hedgerows, the kitchens stayed behind. The gap between the field kitchen and the front line could be miles. Meals were prepared, loaded into insulated containers, and driven forward under cover. Sometimes they arrived warm, sometimes they arrived cold. Sometimes they didn't arrive at all. For men in forward positions, a hot meal from the field kitchen was an event. It marked a temporary reprieve. It was eaten quickly, often standing, before returning to the line. The memory of that warmth lasted longer than the meal itself. Food became currency. American troops carried items British and Canadian soldiers didn't have. British units had tea and different ration components. Canadians brought their own supply variations. Trading networks formed. Americans traded cigarettes and Hershey's chocolate bars. 4 cigarettes could get you a tin of British tea. A chocolate bar might be worth a Canadian's canned corned beef. Coffee was valuable. Everyone wanted coffee, but American rations had more of it. The exchanges weren't formal. No price lists or negotiated rates. Just soldiers recognizing that what they had in surplus, someone else needed. A pack of Chesterfields for a tin of jam. Powdered lemonade mix for biscuits that weren't crumbling sawdust. French civilians entered the trade network after towns were liberated. Fresh bread was the prize. Real bread, baked in stone ovens that had survived the bombardment. Soldiers traded rations, cigarettes, anything portable for a loaf that didn't come from a waxed cardboard box. Eggs appeared, milk, butter. Items that didn't exist in military rations. A Norman farmer might trade a dozen eggs for chocolate to give his children. An old woman might offer cheese for coffee she hadn't tasted since 1940. But trading was more than economics. Sharing a meal created connection. Passing a canteen. Splitting a ration tin between 2 men when supply hadn't caught up. Heating extra coffee and offering a cup to the soldier in the next foxhole. These acts didn't require language or rank. A British private and an American corporal sharing a fire to heat rations. A Canadian sharing tinned peaches with a Frenchman who'd been living on occupation rations for 4 years. The ritual mattered. Sitting together even for 5 minutes, even in a muddy hedgerow with artillery audible in the distance. The meal itself was often forgettable. canned hash, stale biscuits, bitter coffee. But eating together reminded men they were human. That normalcy still existed somewhere beyond the combat zone. Men remembered who shared, who offered the last cigarette or split their ration when yours was lost in a river crossing. Those small exchanges built trust faster than any speech or order. Food was survival, but sharing food was solidarity. It marked the difference between isolated individuals enduring war and a cohesive unit surviving it together. Every shared meal, every trade, every cup of coffee passed between soldiers reinforced the bonds that kept men functional when everything else was designed to break them. Normandy's battlefields didn't offer kitchens or dining hours. Soldiers cooked in stolen minutes between firefights, using whatever they could carry and whatever wouldn't give away their position. The meals were monotonous, often cold, sometimes inedible. But they were necessary, not just for calories, but for the brief return to something resembling normal human life. The ingenuity mattered. Heating a can on a pocket stove, digging a Dakota fire hole to hide flames, boiling water in a helmet because no pot existed. These weren't skills taught in training manuals. They were learned through necessity and passed soldier to soldier in hedgerows and foxholes. The sharing mattered more. A tin of hash split between two men. Coffee brewed and passed down a line. Chocolate traded for bread with a French civilian who hadn't seen sugar in years. These exchanges didn't change the war's outcome, but they changed how men endured it. Food on the Normandy front wasn't about taste or comfort. It was about function and survival. It was about maintaining enough strength to continue when every part of your body wanted to stop. And it was about preserving enough humanity to remember why survival mattered in the first place. The soldiers who fought through hedgerows and coastal fortifications carried rations designed for durability, not pleasure. They improvised cooking methods under conditions that made every meal a calculated risk. They shared what little they had because isolation was another enemy, as dangerous as the one across the field. These reconstructions exist to show that reality. Not the romanticized version, not the Hollywood campfire. The actual experience of men trying to eat enough to stay alive while someone tried to kill them. The field kitchens that brought moments of warmth to exhausted units. The trades that built networks of trust across armies and nations. Normandy was won through firepower, logistics, and tactical execution. But it was endured through small acts of normalcy, through the decision to heat a meal instead of eating it cold, through the choice to share coffee when you could have kept it, through the recognition that even in war, even in mud and death and constant threat, men still needed to eat. And how they did it mattered.